Happy New Year, everyone. Just give us another minute or two while we accept folks into the webinar and we'll get started. Um, Hope you all had a wonderful holiday. And so now we're trying to get our brains back in gear. And one good way to do that is the webinar that we have for you today. So thank you for joining us. And we'll get started in just a minute. All right. Well, I'm seeing that many of our attendees are now with us, so we'll go ahead and get started. Again, greetings from wherever you are. I know that we have a worldwide audience, so good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and some of you late into the evening. So we really appreciate you being with us. Happy New Year, and we hope that you had a wonderful holiday season with your families and friends. My name is Dave Cadu, and I'm honored to be the CEO and director of IWCS, and I'll be your moderator for today's webinar event. As always, just a few housekeeping items for you. You are part of a larger audience, so during the presentation, all participants will remain in listen-only mode. And also as a reminder, this event is being rebroadcast or recorded for rebroadcast. It'll be available through our website and on our YouTube channel. I will be providing the contact points for Jose, our presenter today, at the end of the webinar. So in case you want to reach out to him directly for any other information on the presentation today. We encourage you to submit questions during the presentation using the chat panel. If you open up the chat, it'll be on the right side of your screen. And after typing in your questions in the space at the bottom, please hit the send button, and your questions will be addressed, time permitting, at the end of the presentation. Our webinar series event today is being hosted by the IWCS Cable and Connectivity Industry Forum, and I'll provide a little more information on our 2025 event here at the end of the webinar. So today we are honored to have Jose Castro, the Fiber Research and Development Manager and Distinguished Engineer at Panduit in Illinois, USA, just outside of Chicago. And Jose will be presenting his paper today on middle mile networks, the digital economy enabler in rural America. Of course, this same enabling opportunity is all around the world, so it will apply to all of us. Dr. Jose Castro is the manager and distinguished engineer of the Fiber Research Group at Panduit. Jose was the editor for Fiber Channel T11.2 and the recipient of the Technical Excellence Award in 2019 from the International Committee for Information Technology Standards. Jose authored over 70 technical articles and has presented in multiple international conferences in his own research areas of optical devices and fiber communications. He is also a co-author of a book on holographic applications in solar energy conversion processes and holds over 25 patents. He is a participant and frequent contributor to the IEEE, TIA, Advanced Photonics Coalition, and the Fiber Channel Standards. So with that, Jose, thank you for being with us, and take it away. Go ahead and share your presentation.
Thank you, David. Let me start sharing my screen.
Thank you.
Okay. Let me know if you can see my screen, please.
You want to check your display settings and adjust it to the full screen mode.
Okay, I think it's, yeah, let me try to do that again.
There you go. Excellent.
Okay,
Looks good. Looks great. So I think you can
okay,
click on it and you can carry on.
perfect. Thank you very much, David, for introduction and for allowing me to present my research here. As you know, and many participants, we present part of this work in the last IWCS conference. So the slides that I'm going to share today are related with broadband and specifically with the middle mile network. This is, you can see now the outline of the presentation. So I'm going to talk about the drivers of bandwidth, the middle mile networks, and optical technologies to enable this middle mile network infrastructure. At the end, I would like to touch base also in the convergence of networks. This is a very interesting topic in which we're going to see how the different technologies for a smart grid also have a lot of commonality with middle mile networks and optical communication networks. Okay, with that, let me start with the first slide. Let me move something here. Okay. Let's start with what fiber optics and digital communications have provided to the society. Fiber optics technology, in particular communication, have enabled applications that we couldn't imagine decades ago. And the progress continues now. And now, more recently, with the applications for AI, this is growing to a pace that we haven't seen before. With all of that, it's very important to provide similar conditions to access all these advances to all the people in the world. In the US in particular, we see a lot of difference between the access in speed and quality, where if you, depending where you are, if you are in a rural area or in an urban area, you will see significant difference in access. And that's something that have to be improved. The effect of this difference that is called digital divide have been evaluated from many years, many decades. As soon as the internet becomes more prevalent around the world, that was around the 90s, there were a lot of studies showing that the access was significantly different for different areas in the US. There have been very interesting work in the books I'm showing in this slide regarding how this digital divide impacted society. In particular, the work of Susan, the first book that I'm showing here, shows that this impact is very significant, but also that if you want to provide high quality networks and access, fiber optics is absolutely necessary to provide the bandwidth. So all these problems have been exacerbated more recently with the COVID pandemic, where we can see rural areas in which they didn't have enough access to continue working during that period. They didn't have access to telemedicine like many of us have, remote access to doctors, and all this information and benefits that internet can provide. So because of that, right now, from probably 4 years ago, we have this Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program, BEAD, that released significant amount of funds, around $40 billion, to enable the access to areas that are not served today, or they are served with low access, low data rates. So all this money that at the end came from us, from the taxpayers, have to be invested looking at the future. Especially now with the advances on AI and different technologies, we need to think that all the investment that we're doing today have to serve for many years, for decades, providing enough bandwidth to all the users. The study of bandwidth has been a very important area from different organizations. For example, IEEE is try to study or start studying the projections of how this bandwidth is going to change in the. This study is started around 2019. So the study wanted to evaluate how different applications are going to grow in the next years relative to whatever bandwidth was in 2017. So this is, for now, is an old study, but what's very important to evaluate where we are today. At the same time, many other organizations or companies have been studying how many hours the users, people like me, like you, spend accessing internet. How much time do you spend in digital media? How many time do you spend streaming? And as you can see in this figure, this has been growing significantly in the last decade, to the point that today we can spend easily 500 minutes daily engaged in digital activities like streaming or social media or accessing other applications in internet. So another important component is how much bandwidth each application needs. In this diagram, you can see that standard applications, audio and high definition 720 doesn't use too much bandwidth. But if you start going to 4K and in the future for 8K, you can see huge amount of increase in bandwidth going to 25 megabits per second, 36. And looking at the future, if you look at virtual reality, especially with a virtual augmented reality retina glass, you can easily reach several hundreds of megabits per second. I presented this study last year. And at that time also, I was trying to evaluate the impact of AI. At that time, AI, and today, is growing very high rate. And for this presentation, I include more data and to see how AI will increase this traffic in the networks even more. So in the previous slide, you saw the bandwidth per application, but now there are more applications, as you can see, just interaction with AI language models, interaction text to text. Today produce kilobytes of data, which are not much for a network. But if you can imagine that there are going to be hundreds or billions of users, then it becomes more significant. But that's nothing yet, because when we go to the next stages of AI applications, text to image or text to video, then you can easily get gigabytes per session. And if you multiply again to the number of users and consider all the time that those users can be engaged in this interaction with the AI systems, then you can imagine that the traffic is going to grow significantly. Companies like Nokia estimated that this traffic is going to reach about 1,000 exabytes per month by 2033, with a significant annual growth. So putting all this together, we see the growth per application due to video principally right now, but in the future due to AI, text to image, text to video, how the access that we have in our house, in our homes, have been changing during the last years. They have been studying from the beginning when you start with a modem that could transmit at 300 bits per second. And this projection show how this bandwidth have been increased since that time to what we are today, around around 300 megabits per second. For example, in my house, I have 300 megabits per second. I have colleagues that have 1 gigabit per second. But what you notice here that there are different tiers. Not all of that have a high bandwidth. There are different levels, different access bandwidth provided to different users. And where you can see a digital divide is if you compare lines like the blue one that you can see here with the red one. The red one is basically DSL. And I have colleagues that until last year, they were limited to 5 or less megabits per second. And even those connections were not stable. So because, as you might know, DSL, the performance or quality depends a lot of the distance. So that's a quality that it cannot be similar for different users, and also very limited. Most of the cases, it's difficult to go more than faster than 10 megabits per second. So this graph also showed that the bit program requirements are at least 100 megabits per second access, and other parameters like latency, less than 100 milliseconds. But if you see the projections, even these 100 megabits per second are not going to be enough by the end of this decade. So the need of more bandwidth due to the applications that I mentioned, and the additional increase due to the future application of AI are going to require significant higher bandwidth. So this is where the middle level plays a significant role. So here I just showing the full a cartoon with the broadband infrastructure, showing the connections that go to your home and how they communicate to the core networks, to the huge data center providers, where most of the information will need to be transmitted to your house. The BID program have been funding significantly the last mile connections. So let's say the central office where you have the equipment, the OLT, optical line terminator, that connects to your home. BID have been providing funds to implement all these networks. But it's very critical to connect all these central office in rural areas to the core networks, right? Because otherwise you might have a very good connections in the last mile, but there is no flow of information that will come from the core, from the very large data centers. So the middle mile accomplish that role of connecting the last mile to the core network. And on the path of that, it can connect not only one town or one small city, it can connect many of them, and includes not only towns, but also data centers that are moving to rural areas or other areas due to many reasons. I mean, real estate and power capacity of obtain power from different zones. So middle mile network can enable all these connections between the last mile, the core networks, and data centers that are in between them. At the same time, the middle mile can provide the connections to the mobile access, to the 5G networks that are very important to deploy also in rural areas. Let's talk a little bit about definitions. according to the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, the middle mile is the crucial infrastructure that connects the backbone of the internet to the local networks, basically what I was describing in the figure, the rural areas. And the main objective, again, is to provide that connection, improve the network performance, and more importantly, provide the flow of information where it's stored in the huge data centers to the final users. The middle mile are very different. So there is not a standard topology and architecture. Typically, there are like rings to provide reliability, but the size and the way they are installed underground or in poles is very different. These just are some examples of different sizes that you can see in middle mile in California and the East Coast, in Chicago. So we usually are talking more than 100 miles, but it can go to very long distance, like 10,000 miles, as you can see in this. What is in the middle mile? So we are participants, members of IWCS. We know a lot about the cabling, copper, and fiber, right? But middle mile incorporates the optical fiber cable, but many other components in between, as you can see in the figure. This is just an example of Illinois and middle mile showing the connections between Chicago and Champaign, showing the links and also the elements that are in the middle mile, like the point of presence, the central office with peering elements, optical cable represented by this line. There are optical components like optical amplifiers. They are called inline amplifier. I'm going to show more information about that. And there are what we call ROADMs, reconfigurable optical absorb multiplexers, that are basically like there are switches that change the path of the light among the network. The difference with the standard switches is that this ROADM doesn't convert the optical signal to the electrical signal and decode it and retransmit it like a switch or a router will do it. This is basically a wavelength selection, and the light will continue propagating, yes, in a different path and with some amplification to different regions or to different zones, but without adding the latency of converting this to electrical, reading the packet information and converting again to optical. Here you see the same image with more focus in the amplification that is very critical, the point of presence and the peering areas. Now, as I mentioned before, the networks are very different. It can be installed in different terrains, in different zones and different sizes. And those are some extreme cases that I select for this presentation. Arizona, 134-mile line of fiber. And the network is actually longer than this. This is just a segment of that. This is in Pima County, where I live. I also have a house in this area, so I am more familiar with this. And also Hawaii, in which you need to connect different islands. So now you have submarine cables to do that. So again, having one definition for middle mile is it cannot comprise all these typical variations that you can have. Now, what is in reality in this infrastructure? We talked a lot in the previous slide about the inline amplification that you can see here. I just want to be a little specific with this. If we go to one of these areas and zooming on in the map, you will see like a hut. We call it regeneration hut that we have inside equipment to amplify the signal. And in many cases, they will have also the ROADMs the add-drop multiplexers that I mentioned before, in which some wavelengths are going to be dropped and other wavelengths can be add. As I mentioned, everything is in the optical domain. The optical signals continue propagating different wavelengths, and other new signals in other wavelengths follow other paths. So you can imagine that it has it like a micro data center, very small, very few cabinets in many cases, but they are different sizes. Other cases can be very long and can have servers with content, information, like Netflix or Hulu. I mean, so to reduce latency between the users for streaming or accessing information. In terms of equipment, I want to talk a little bit more, as I mentioned, the ROADMs, the amplifiers, transponders, and passive equipment, optical fiber distribution frames. Basically, and of course, power and electricity are very important. And this is what I'm going to show perhaps here in this slide. It's better described what you find in one of these huts. You need power, you need points to splice the fiber, to separate the fiber from the cables, and splice to fiber that will go inside this hut. You need panels, distribution frames. Basically, it's like, as I mentioned, very, very small representation of a data center. Talking about equipment, we talk about the transponder, the add-drop multiplexer again, and those are just examples showing how basically this system will go through the transponders. The transponder basically will generate the optical signal, and you will have, as I mentioned, an add-drop multiplexer with combine different wavelengths, and you have an amplification system. I have the term here, dark fiber. It can be in general many type of fibers or systems that you can have in this case. Dark fiber is one example only, but it is very common use today. Just to go a little bit more in the fiber. The fiber that is being used today for all these systems, for communication systems, is the standard G652 fiber, G52D fiber. So that fiber has been developed probably 20 years ago. So it has been improved in recent years, but most of the development and the characteristics of the fiber date from a couple of decades. Whereas the transceiver technology has been evolving very fast because it's related with electronics, and it's related with the size of the chips that you can have in the transponders or transceivers. So what is happening in the last decade is significant improvement in these silicon systems. So you can reduce, we have been able to reduce the size of these transmitters or transponders from very large form factors that you can see here, 5 times 7 inches, to what is a very small transceiver that you can put actually in a switch or a router. And that significantly has reduced the cost and the power consumption. All of these systems that we use for middle mile are coherent systems, basically, for the long distance communication, for the 100 kilometers or 500 kilometers or 1,000 kilometers. That's an important difference with relative to transceivers used in data centers. In data centers, as I'm showing in this slide, usually in the past, we transmit just we modulate the optical power of the signal, the intensity of the signals. Until 2014, that modulation was just between zeros and ones. So basically, a signal was on and off. with some level of bias. Since around 2014, PAM4 have been used significantly. Pulse amplitude modulation is the meaning of PAM4, have been used significantly in data center systems. But still, the modulation is the power of the optical signal you can see here. Different levels represent different powers. For broadband, for telecom, right now the predominant transmission systems are coherent. What's the meaning of that? That in a coherent system, you not only can modulate the power or the amplitude of the signal, but you can modulate the phase. So it's more related with a wireless system. As you can, if you have any familiarity with the Wi-Fi or 5G, a coherent system works with similar principles. The phase is being modulated. Now, the main difference is that when you have your Wi-Fi system, you are talking about carriers of 5 gigahertz, in the future going to 25 or even higher millimeter wave height. So what we're talking about gigahertz, 5, 10, 25. But in optical, we're talking about terahertz. So 1,000 times that. And when we're talking about these optical signals, we're talking most likely around 193, 94 terahertz. So that's the reason this system provides this huge capacity to transmit terabits of data over long distance. In my group, we have been evaluating the transceivers that have been used or are being used today for this application to transmit all these signals for hundreds of kilometers or 500 kilometers. One technology very relevant today and is very commonly used in the system is the 400 gig CR. And this transceiver, a very small form factor, you can see in this picture, using test equipment for bit error ratios and evaluation with fiber, is very small. It can be put in one of the slots. Actually, it's here where my mouse is. Sorry, I was pointing in my screen. I'm going to move my mouse here. This transceiver is basically here. So it's a very small transceiver that can transmit 400 gig over 120 miles in this case. And not only that, in this transceiver, the carrier that I was talking, the optical carrier, you can tune that wavelength to different values. So if you populate a router, let's say with many of these transceivers, in the same fiber, you can transmit 10, 40 or more channels, each of one with 400 gig per second. So that increased significantly the capacity and the distance of the fiber. The technology continue evolving. Last year in October, the 800 gig CR was released. All of that are very small form factor transceivers that could replace the transponders. But the transponder technology, so the bigger systems, are also evolving, right? So the main difference is that the transponder have more capacity in terms of power or thermal dissipation, so they can run more process. They can have better performance. That's the reason right now many companies call these performance units versus the pluggable units. The transceivers are pluggable because you can plug that in the switch of the router. But in this graph, you can see the evolution, how fast and how much distance can we transmit with different technologies, with the coherent technologies. Right? If we go, and all of this evolution have been being enabled because of the reduction in size of the silicon, the fixtures, the transistors in the silicon, that enables more power efficient systems that can run faster and faster. From many years ago, the 70 gigabytes have been used using technology of 16 nanometers. Right now, there are companies that are working with prototypes or even products in the near term of 200 gigabytes at 3 nanometers. So the faster you go, like in wireless, the shorter the distance. But if you can look at the figure here, at 1.2 terabits, terabits per second, so I'm looking for a mouse. With the previous technology, the yellow one, 120 gigabytes, 5 nanometers resolution in the chip, you can go hundreds of kilometers, 50 kilometers. Whereas if you go to, you want to reach 2,000 kilometers, you still can use this technology and provide have a bandwidth around 600 gigabytes per second. With the latest, with the state of the art, you can go 800 gigabytes per second at 2,000 kilometers. So what's the meaning for that for a network? Is now, if you put this in the context of in the United States, we can easily go from Chicago to LA 3,000 kilometers at very high data rates, right? Like 400 gigabytes per second. The shorter the distance, again, the higher the data rates that you can have. So all of these new technologies can be applied to the middle mile and also can provide can produce changes in the topology of the network. Today, typically you use routers that connect using what we call gray optics, so the data center transceivers that connects to transponders that connects to the ROADMs that I was talking about, and those provide the connections, let's say in the middle mile network. With the new transceivers, you can bypass the transponder and the gray optics that connects directly to the ROADMs. That's one option, one simplification. Another option that other companies have been discussing is connecting the routers directly using embedded systems. So different options. The technology evolves, the transceivers become more power efficient, smaller form factors. But in the group I work in fiber R&D, we are technology agnostic, so we want to evaluate the potential value for different applications. So I think technologies like these, just using routers in the network, are going to be very good value for certain type of networks. Other type of networks will still benefit of the traditional ROADMs, just because when you have the ROADMs, you don't convert the optical to the electrical and then to the optical again. So you minimize that latency of conversion, you minimize the power consumption, and basically all the network operates in the optical domain. Now, when you go to the routers directly, you have the flexibility to read the IP address and to direct this perhaps more efficiently. Right? There is a trade-off. There are many studies today which technology is the best one, and there are different positions from different companies. And what we believe so far is that there is application for both of them, but different scale. If you want to go to longer networks at very high data rate, perhaps the option using the ROADMs is still more efficient. But if you want to implement something simpler for shorter distance, let's say 100 miles, 200 miles, this option with the routers and the new pluggable transceivers in very small form factors are very have significant advantage too. So before going to the summary of this presentation, I wanted to talk a little bit about convergence between different networks. So the electrical and telecommunications are fundamental services for society. And both structures share some similarity. Both of them require extensive networks, the smart grid to provide the power along the states, and the telecom or broadband to provide information. And they require a lot of investment too. And all of that requires sharing information. Smart grid now requires real-time data and advanced communication technologies to monitor the network in real time. There are technologies like to read the demand of the user in real time, so the utility providers can balance the supply of energy with the demand of energy. All of that requires very low latency. The amount of information to achieve that is not very large, like in broadband, but requires very secure channels because this is critical infrastructure at very low latency. That is where the convergence between the middle mile that I was describing in previous slide and the smart grid occurs. Let me go to the next slide. So the middle mile can be an enabler for the smart grid, for utility grid that can be connected there. But at the same time, can be a user. The utility grid can provide, because they already have fiber optic installed, they can provide some channels for the broadband application too. So there is a convergence technology there. Granted that the application is different. Utility smart grid is a critical infrastructure, so requires different protocols of communication, more levels of security, but there is part of the infrastructure that can be shared among these technologies. So this is the summary of my presentation. The middle mile is essential to support the rural ISPs and ensure that rural areas have access to high-quality internet services, especially now with the growth of different applications driven fundamentally by AI. I also mentioned that the middle miles are very different, and I show the different requirements for bandwidth, being the video, the high-resolution video, 4K and the future 8K, one of the major drivers today for bandwidth. But in the future, virtual reality, augmented reality, and AI are going to be predominant, are going to go beyond that. Bandwidth requirements are expected to reach several terabits per second per fiber. And the pluggable technology that I show is going to be have a significant impact to reduce the deployment costs and complexity of the networks. But at the same time, we need to consider that technologies like ROADMs are going to be essential to provide efficient operation of these networks. And also, as I mentioned, there is some convergence between the networks. Those are complementary technologies, the middle mile, the smart grid, and also the 5G that can be connected to the middle mile. And with that, I will end my presentation. Thank you for attending, and I will be happy to answer any question.
Jose, thank you so much for that very interesting summary, a very, very practical approach to how we are going to expand our broadband capabilities to all communities. One question is, obviously with the bandwidth that we're hoping to achieve and the applications that we want to put over the network, at some point, I'm assuming that fiber to the home is the optimum network, but there's a lot of applications where there's a transfer over to the copper media, the coaxial cables. Where is it practical, do you see, in this network chain to have an efficient transfer to copper? Obviously, many homes are now, connected with service providers using coaxial applications. Where is it the most practical as you see it in the future?
Today, there is some the fiber reach certain point in the network, and from that you have today hybrid solutions like hybrid fiber and coaxial, like I'm showing in this image. Let me just move here. If you can consider that this is the fiber, and then it goes to hybrid fiber and coaxial. So today, even my house is connected in this way, right? But what I'm showing in this slide is moving to the future, moving to 100 megs plus, right? Right now, with that connection, I can have easily 300 megs, and there is new standards to provide much more than that. But at some point, the bandwidth of the optical fiber cannot be matched with copper, and we need to be realistic, right? I mean, there's going to be a transition in which when you reach perhaps 1 gig because or less, in where the fiber becomes significantly more efficient, especially because the fiber you can use you can divide this signal more efficiently with passive optical splitters, right? You can divide one channel in 32 and 64 up to 128. So it becomes more efficient to connect with fiber than using copper in reality, right? The receivers for optical fiber in the houses are very inexpensive. They are not complex, the ONTs or ONUs that you have there. The complexity is in the transmitter and the OLT, which is in the central office. So at this point, with the bandwidth that we require and how this is evolving, in my view, fiber is going to be critical to provide that bandwidth. Of course, there are going to be areas in which you cannot put the fiber. Installing the fiber is very expensive. So you have options like fixed wireless can provide that, and also satellites, right? Well, going to satellites, you need to evaluate the performance in terms of latency. It's not only bandwidth. The applications in the future will require latency. In this presentation, I couldn't focus on all these potential parameters, but latency of 10 milliseconds or less will be needed if you want application of telemedicine or even gaming, right? So I see the future towards fiber, essentially, right? To provide all these bandwidth and services.
Yeah, fiber to the home, fiber to the office, fiber to, as far as you can get it, to your routers and other things. As you see it in, the broadband deployment and obviously the infrastructure spending that the US government is doing, but this is happening all over the world. But here in the US, do you see that this network infrastructure, using, the middle mile and all that, is already being deployed around major metropolitan areas like Chicago, and now it's really all about getting it to rural environments? Where are we, I guess, in terms of, completing this vision across an entire nation?
Yeah, no, it's a very good question. I think in the urban areas, there is no problem. There are metropolitan networks serving and connecting all these last mile to the core networks. But the main thing here, David, is even if there is some urban areas that they don't have that, there is a business case, right? I mean, there is so much density in the urban areas that even if you have a new urban area, there is a business case for a ISP to go there and put their central office because there is revenue, right? There are users that are going to take those services. Whereas when you go to rural areas, the density can be so low that there is not a business case. That's the reason of the government providing funds. So yeah, basically urban areas, I don't see any problem. If there is, they will be connected soon with enough bandwidth. The rural areas are the ones that, because the revenue is not assured there because the density is very low, it requires more efforts.
You mentioned the G652D fiber in the very beginning of your presentation. Anything on the fiber side that can help enhance the middle mile?
The fiber I mentioned is already very good to work with the coherent transceiver, right? We use coherent transceivers because I didn't mention in the presentation, the fiber, one of the main limitations of the fiber is the attenuation and dispersion. The attenuation is solved using amplifiers, that you have the inline amplifiers that I showed in previous slide, and you put those amplifiers every 80 miles or so. But even with amplifiers, one additional problem is the dispersion. So the pulses that you want to send spread along, similar to copper cables in some way, but the physical principle is different. So the fiber that we have today for many, many years, for a couple of decades, is good enough to work with the coherent transceivers, because when you are with coherent system, you can equalize, you can correct the chromatic dispersion significantly better than using data center transceivers. So perhaps because of that, they have not been a significantly need to modify the fiber. Now there are options. There is a fiber that have much less chromatic dispersion, but it's a new fiber. It doesn't have the developing of the standard fiber that is very robust, have been testing to work with cables with very large number of fibers. The new fiber is called hollow core fiber. So hollow core fiber have less chromatic dispersion. It have much less latency, 30% less latency. We have been testing the fiber set for a couple of years, but it's extremely costly. Right? This is business case. I mean, this fiber is probably 2 orders of magnitude more expensive than the standard fiber. So I think they need to improve the fiber significantly. Having been there to open a business, to invest a lot on that. It was more efficient to invest in the coherent transceivers and make the same fiber as installed work for longer distance and high data rates. I don't know if I answered your question, but it's a very good question, Dave.
Yeah, yeah. The age-old problem between the MSOs and electric utilities and right-of-ways and things like that, particularly, around major metropolitan areas, but obviously in rural areas as well. Clearly the funding, has yet, at this point only achieved limited success. What are the obstacles that we can overcome, or what is necessary to make sure that the middle mile network convergence can happen, and get around some of these, bottlenecks within local municipalities?
Yeah, no, that's a very important topic, right? The enabler of this is not only the funds. This is more complex like that, right? This
Yeah.
requires a collaboration, a partnership between the rural municipalities, the government that will provide part of the funds, not completely all the funds, only partially, and businesses, right? Rural ISPs that want to provide the service, and they probably can monetize that, because if the infrastructure of the middle mile that I show is already there, the cost to implement the last mile are smaller. So it requires a lot of partnership, including the utilities services that they already have infrastructure for fiber. So they also, in many cases, they provide the broadband services too. So it's basically collaboration and partnership, looking what the town, what the rural area will need in the next decade.
Yep. One last question. You talked about the ROADMs versus routers. Is there a preference among the service providers between these different approaches?
I think the prevalent technology today is using the ROADMs. Using the routers have been discussed for many years, if I remember, but that using the routers has become more relevant due to the developing of the 400G transceiver that I showed, the CR transceiver, the small one, because that enables to use a router and put just the transceivers there. I think there are going to be a lot of discussions with people and companies with more experience on that. So far, I see different arguments, right? I mean, using just the ROADMs or the routers, each one have an advantage and disadvantage, as I showed before. My opinion is for the midterm, the ROADMs are going to be used, and they are very efficient if you want to provide high bandwidth, lower latency. The routers are easier to implement in the smaller network. So both of them will have applications, but let's see what the market decides.
Right. Well, obviously, our industry is very vital to the success of our future communities, and it'll be very interesting to see how we achieve all of this over the next 10 years or so. But again, thank you, Jose. Great perspectives on the big picture here and how we're going to accomplish these important objectives. Please note the contact points for Jose that I'm showing now. Should you wish to contact Jose after today's event, I'm sure he'd be more than happy to address any questions that you might have separate from the webinar today. Each of our IWCS webinar series presentations are recorded, as I mentioned, and are archived on our from our website. So please feel free to share that information with your colleagues, who I'm sure would also benefit from hearing today's presentation. The IWCS webinar series will conduct its next technical paper presentation webinar on Friday, February the 21st. Typically, we conduct these on the third Friday of each month at 10:30 a.m. Eastern USA time. So each of you will be receiving an announcement for these events, and please feel free to share those announcements to your colleagues so that they can join and register as well. It's important before we conclude to recognize and thank all of our IWCS partner level sponsors who contribute greatly to the success of our Cable and Connectivity Industry Forum. Without their strong leadership and generosity, we would not be able to bring these important technical innovations and information to you and our global community. So again, thank you to all of these leading suppliers in our industry. With that, we're really excited. A lot of work happening here at the beginning of January to begin the planning for our 2025 IWCS Cable and Connectivity Industry Forum. It will be taking place in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, USA, at the end of October, the 27th through the 30th. And we are now just about to launch our call for papers. So like this particular paper, but many, many other important technologies that you're working on, please consider putting in an abstract, a simple, description of your work through our call for papers process. That you'll be receiving those announcements next week, and also on our website. So that will launch, and then the deadlines will be in April for us to consider the abstracts and generate the program in Pittsburgh. So again, our 74th annual conference will be the 27th to the 30th. And again, thank you for participating today. we wish you again a very happy and healthy new year, and have a great weekend. For those of us here in the US, stay warm. It's going to be bitterly cold. And again, our hearts and prayers for our friends in Los Angeles with the devastating fires that they've been experiencing recently. So again, have a great weekend and take care.